Hello and welcome back to Anglo Election Insights. Today we are having a look into the two by-elections that were held in Victoria over the weekend and just doing a little bit of a post-count analysis in the wake of them as we await the final results, particularly from Werribee where the count hasn't been finalised. So we had two of them. One was in Prahran, which is sort of an inner southeastern district in Melbourne. That's not it, that's Werribee, that's Prahran. So a lot of renters, sort of younger, well-educated demographic. Some sort of more established older money in the northern part of the electorate and then a bit less so down south. And then we had Werribee in the outer suburbs of western Melbourne, mostly concentrated in this kind of outer metropolitan area with a few sort of outlying rural areas heading down towards Geelong. So we'll start over in Prahran, which produced the biggest surprise of the night. I had originally said or predicted that this would be a pretty comfortable 7 or 8% retain for the Greens. I did put out a community note about a week later saying it was going to be a bit tighter, but I certainly didn't expect the Liberals to pick this one up. Effectively, what has happened is that the Greens' primary vote has stagnated. Labor didn't run, and with the absence of their vote and their how-to-vote cards and preferences, Tony Lupton, the independent, was able to direct a lot of his preferences to the Liberals, and that's effectively what got them over the line. I think last time in the general election, Liberals, the preferences basically went something like 75% to the Greens. But as we can see here this time, they've gone 55% to the Liberal Party. And then another thing to note is the fact that the Greens won the election day vote on the booths, but look what happened on the early vote. Narrow win to the Liberals, but what really brought them home was the postals, winning a majority of the postals. Incredible. Yeah, 65-35. So I guess what we can sort of draw from this one is, firstly, low turnout is going to hurt the Greens in a district where there's a lot of renters, there's a lot of students, there's a lot of more sort of transient voters. I was actually passing through South Yarra that day, and the Greens actually had volunteers posted outside the train station in South Yarra, probably a kilometre away from the nearest booth, handing out how to vote cards and reminding people that there was a by-election on. And insiders had already expressed worry in the days leading up to the by-election that turnout was going to be an issue, and it really was. Turnout is currently at about 65% of enrolment, which is crazy low. But that's probably not going to be a factor in any upcoming general elections, whether it be overlapping federal seats or 2026. For the Liberals' part, they ran quite a smart campaign. They highlighted a lot of the social and sort of crime problems plaguing the Chapel Street precinct, which seemed to resonate. Rachel Westaway ran at somewhat of a distance to Brad Batten, the new leader. Her as a moderately aligned candidate definitely suited the area. They were clever, they were smart, they really nailed the brief. Whereas I think the Greens, apart from the turnout, the other thing that really hurt them was not only the lack of Labor preferences, but the manner of Sam Hibbins' exit from the seat. Not only do I think he'd built up a pretty reasonable personal vote, but when you have these scandals, it can leave a particularly bad taste, and I do think that was partially a factor as well in the swing away from the Greens. But yeah, apart from that, 14% swing against the Greens, absolutely wild. Very few people predicted this would happen. I actually don't know what's more shocking to me, that the Liberals won it or that turnout was only 65%. That's crazy to me on both counts. I think the main takeaways here in terms of federal implications is that McNamara could actually shape up as a genuine three-way contest under the right conditions. I think if the Liberals are able to improve their primary, if the issue of anti-Semitism is one that they are able to harness correctly, and they also manage to pick a good candidate who understands the area and appeals to the more sort of moderate lean of the voters, they could improve their primary to the point where it's actually a competitive race between them and the Greens, if the Greens were to come second, because they didn't get a great preference flow without Labor there, even though, you know, all those Labor voters are still in the district. So who's to say that the Greens are going to get this really tight preference flow at the federal level as well? So it could be a really interesting situation where the Greens end up coming second in McNamara, but Labor preferences aren't enough to push them over the line because there isn't a really good flow. But I'm really struggling to think of a scenario where Labor finish second and they don't end up winning. But just an interesting idea. The other thing is related to the Greens. It's a bit hard to draw too many conclusions when turnout was so low and the conditions of this by-election were so specific. But perhaps all this posturing on Gaza and their lack of action on housing in terms of blocking Labor's agenda and just the general sort of underlying shift away from progressive politics that seems to be happening on a sort of worldwide scale. Perhaps that will play out to a slightly greater degree in an area like McNamara, and the Greens might have a little bit more success in a place like Wills, where the Gaza issue is probably going to work a lot better for them, particularly in the northern part of that electorate. So this could be a precursor to a slight change of strategy from the Greens, or it might not. We shall see. But yeah, the big takeaway is that while the Greens vote stagnated and they were hurt by low turnout and the way the MP exited, it's pretty unlikely that this specific seat would be retained by the Liberals in a general election. But now they've got their member in, you never know, she might be able to build up a strong enough profile and personal vote to hang on. So next up, we have Werribee, which is still ongoing. It's super close, only about 400 or 500 votes separates Liberals and Labor on two-party preferred at the moment. We can see the percentages there. It's only 0.6%. But at this stage, the later batches of postal votes that are still to come in are probably not going to be friendly enough to the Liberals to allow them to bridge that gap. So I think we can say with some level of confidence that Labor has retained here, but it's definitely not over just yet. The thing that's going to stand out to us here is the nearly 17% swing on primary vote against Labor. That is enormous. But it didn't all go to the Liberals. They only picked up 3.7% from the 2022 result. The big beneficiary was, in fact, Paul Hopper, who ran as an independent last time and ran again this time. And he's shaping up to be a key player in terms of a little team of independents he's putting together, looking to challenge some of these Labor-held seats in Western Victoria at the state level, well, Western Melbourne, I should say, at the state level, including the likes of Joe Gower and Ian Birchall, those sorts of characters. From a standing start at a by-election, he was able to grab nearly 15% of the vote. If he had more of a chance to really get his message out there and got a little bit more media attention perhaps, and the electorate on the whole was a little bit more engaged, as they probably would be in the case of a general election, maybe he would get enough votes to actually make the two-party preferred count. That'd be a really interesting one to watch. At the same time, there's this battle in the West between the Greens and the Victorian Socialists. Victorian Socialists are known for running really strong ground campaigns. They door knock, they letterbox, they get their big crew in, and they really target certain areas. They know where they're strong, and they really go for it. And I think what we're seeing is in these more working class, outer suburban seats with a lot of ethnic diversity and these low sort of socioeconomic areas, I think the Greens are gaining this perception that they are a party of sort of more affluent people, perhaps a little bit more concerned with social issues, whereas the Victorian Socialists seem to present more kind of practical economic solutions that appeal more to working class, low socioeconomic voters. And we're seeing that more and more, and that could be significant when we're looking at the state upper house in 2026. So that's definitely a trend to keep an eye on. But we'll have a look at some of the more detailed results here for Werribee. Labor also won on the day, but the Liberals had a narrow win on the early vote, as in the pre-poll, and then also a narrow win on postals, which, had that been a more significant win on postals, perhaps they'd be favourite to actually bridge the gap in votes. But no, unfortunately for them, that probably won't be the case. So, as far as the big takeaways, firstly at the state level, it seems that the Victorian Liberal Party doesn't have the appeal that it needs in these western suburbs. They don't seem to have the ground game. They don't have the local party structure. And I think their choice of candidate probably reflects some of the issues that they currently have out in the west. They picked a guy who currently lives in Essendon, bit of a sort of fuddy-duddy older guy. Were they really serious about getting this guy into Parliament when there was a guy who... Well, there were some Liberal insiders who thought that an Indian candidate should have been pre-selected, someone who really had a bit more appeal directly in this area. I think the Liberals definitely have some work to do if they're going to start winning seats out west, and that is by building on their own appeal and their own party structure in this part of Melbourne, so that instead of this anger against Labor just spraying around everywhere and ending up with all kinds of different parties and then inevitably coming home to Labor through preferences, that the Liberal Party are actually able to appeal to those voters and soak up some of that vote. Because if you look at some of the margins in these Western Melbourne seats, Werribee was a great example. It was a double-digit margin, and even in what were ultimately very friendly by-election conditions for the Liberals, they weren't able to pick it up. You get the sense that this was their sort of Ipswich West moment, and they throttled it a little bit, you'd have to say, even though, a 9.8% swing, that, it's not bad. It's not bad, but they need more. They need those kinds of swings in a general election across the board in Western Melbourne, and they're not going to be able to do it if they're not pre-selecting the right candidates and organising out west in areas that they haven't really campaigned properly in for decades. The other thing that stands out to me is, and we touched on it before, but Paul Hopper, him and some of the other local independents that will no doubt run in 2026 have a good chance of soaking up a lot of this vote that was coming from Labor, perhaps was coming from the Greens, and is looking for a new home. They don't want to vote Liberal, but they want to vote for a local independent that they trust, and with really good campaigns, well-funded, well-resourced, and with perhaps a little bit more media attention, someone like a Paul Hopper is absolutely a chance of making the two-party count, or the two-candidate preferred count. And I would imagine Liberal preferences would be quite strong to them, and it might be enough to push themselves into the lead, particularly if the Labor vote's going to stall out in the late 20s. That would absolutely be be on if they were able to achieve that. And then looking a little bit further afield at the federal level, could the federal seat of Hawke be in play? So the by-election was down here, kind of in the Werribee area. Overlapping federal seat is Labor, so is Layla, that's a safe Labor seat. But Hawke has a similar kind of profile in many ways, particularly this area around Sunbury and sort of into Truganina and these kind of peri-urban areas. They have populations with a lot of ethnic diversity. There's the same issues with transport infrastructure, the increasing sort of visibility of crime as a community safety issue, and that same disaffection with the Labor Party, that same dissatisfaction, with cost of living, really informing the votes of some of these people. And the question has to be, well, maybe the Victorian Liberals, having just burned through another state leader, maybe they aren't cutting through to these voters, but is Peter Dutton able to cut through to some of these voters? That's the difference. Hawke is held on 7.6% by Labor. The current MP, more of a sort of factional power broker than a really active local member, from what I understand. So in the right conditions, it would be the sort of seat that would be vulnerable. But the question is, can Dutton actually pick up that vote? Because as we've seen in Werribee, there definitely is anger and resentment towards Labor, and some of the support they picked up in 2022 is definitely not sticky. The other implications are for these two seats, Gorton and Corwell, where you have long-time Labor MPs retiring. Now, the margins are more than 10%, and they're probably not liable to actually flipping, but these could be new marginal seats for Labor going into 2028. And if it does end up being Labor that forms government, particularly if it's a messy minority government with, deals with the crossbench and the Greens, those are the sorts of seats that could continue to move towards the Liberal column. And then, of course, with the state election in 2026, there's a whole stack of Labor seats up here that could potentially be up for grabs. Anyway, thanks for having listened, guys. Hope that analysis provides a little bit of insight into what actually happened on the night and what the implications could be. I think best remember that by-elections are unique beasts, and the circumstances that surround them don't get repeated at the general elections. So we don't want to look into them too closely, but it's pretty hard to ignore, a 17% swing against Labor at the primary vote level. That's definitely a pretty clear data point, and that's definitely going to be worrying Labor HQ. But as we've seen, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Liberal Party are shoo-ins to win some of these seats. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.